Chapter 17, Europe during the Enlightenment. The really most important idea behind the Enlightenment was the idea that reason could guide human affairs. And what makes that revolutionary? Well, it means that you didn't have to take for granted the way things are or what the Catholic Church said. You could use your own ability to think and observe and reason to come to some new conclusion about the political situation, about the way you live, or whatever. Even the structure of your economy and your place in it. How's your relationship with other people? And it's in that context of disseminating this kind of understanding and the need for rational analysis and the use of reason that a new kind of figure emerged in the Enlightenment, that of the intellectual celebrity, which we're going to call the philosopher. Very, very short film. I think it's about 30 seconds long. Hopefully it's going to play with no problem. One minute and 12 seconds.
Created using Powtoon.
Kind of cute. But it basically tells you what it was. It was people who were thinking, and you're going to find that most of the philosophers in the Enlightenment period were those same people who were leaders in the scientific revolution. The Enlightenment concerns were possibly the dangers of unchecked and arbitrary authority, such as divine kings, and the values of religious toleration, and don't just hate somebody because they're a different religion. The importance of law, reason, and human dignity, which is something had never been considered before. Now, the economic growth in the 18th century or 1700s was really phenomenal. There was agricultural advancements such as iron plows and shod horses that began to produce more food per acre. There was a decline in morality from infectious diseases. The Black Plague had just kind of been not wiped out, just kind of moved on. And the massive urban population of people coming from the farms to the city. London's population in 1700 was 674,000. In 1800, just 100 years later, it was over 860,000. Naples' population in 1600 was 300,000. In 1800, it was 500,000. Yes, a lot of this depended on developments in trade and manufacturing. And in some part, develops of single manufacturing districts, like in New England, you had the cloth materials where they would spin stuff into cloth and make it into shirts and things. In the South, we had other products. And there's a world of goods. And of course, there's so many people living in the cities now, you've got a mass market for consumer goods. And because more people are working, they can buy them. You have a rise of the service sector. You've got more and more people working as waitresses and things like this. Now, Europe's economy was really complex. It was specialized, it was integrated, it was commercialized, and productive more than it had ever been before. This just shows you briefly the population growth. As you can see, it's not growing in the Ottoman Empire. It's not growing in Poland or Russia as much. Norway, Sweden, it's kind of cold there. Scotland, southern England is, but northern England is not. Portugal, Spain, but France, Holy Roman Empire, which is going to be Germany, Switzerland, Italy, these places are going gangbusters. An 18th century phenomenon was, some of the basic characteristics, was the power of human reason. And when people have self-confidence, they reason a little bit better. The Newtonian methods had been wide applicated, and David Hume wrote a treatise of human nature in 1739 to 40. Mr. Kant wrote Dare to Know. The reason needed autonomy and freedom. You have to have that if you're going to think and be reasonable. You have to have a little freedom. The Holy Trinity is simply, it's not talking about the church. We're talking about the three great minds of the previous decades, the scientific revolution, Bacon, Newton, and Locke. Locke wrote an essay called Concerning Human Understanding, and in it he expressed his desire and need for the society as a whole to have education and to help the environment and get rid of some of that pollution in the air. A sense of perception, and the tabula rasa, which is his idea that when a baby is born, the mind is a blank. It's like a blank slate to be educated. He also believed in the goodness and perfectibility of the humanity. The church had been teaching that we were all deprived and depraved and going to hell if we didn't change our ways, but he believed that people could change and be much better. Moral improvement and social progress, and with moral improvement, you're going to have social progress. The Enlightenment thinkers sought to organize all knowledge, make it all in one place. Using the scientific method, we're going to collect evidence on the rise and fall of nations. We're going to compare different government constitutions. We're going to compare the culture of Enlightenment thinkers, and it's going to be international. And despite stiff resistance, the Enlightenment was beginning to flourish all across Central and Southern Europe. Not so much Northern Europe, but Southern Europe. The philosophy. The philosopher was a free thinker, unhampered by the constraints of religion or dogma in any form, such as Voltaire, born Francis Marie Arnett. He was supposed to be the personification of the Enlightenment. In his life, well, he had a very rigid education. He was educated by Jesuits, which were one of the most strict form of the religious monks, priests. He even spent some time in the Bastille, the French jail, for libel. He was so bad that he was even for a while temporarily exiled out of France into England, where he became a great admirer of all things English, especially Newton and Locke. Philosophical letters. Voltaire wrote them. Religious and political liberties of the British he thought were absolutely great. He liked the British open-mindedness and the imperialism. He was an admirer of English culture in all forms, especially their politics, and he respected and also saw how much scientists were respected in England. He loved the British religious toleration, and his observations on England were seen as, of course, criticisms for his home country of France. Crush infamy, all forms of repression, fanaticism, and bigotry is what he wanted to do. He loathed religious bigotry. He did not oppose religion, but he sought to rescue morality from the narrow dogma of some, especially the Catholic Church. He believed in common sense and simplicity. He even had contacts with Frederick of Prussia and Catherine the Great of Russia, who were known as enlightened despots. Baron de Montesquieu. Now, he was born of a very noble family, and he inherited a rather large estate. He served as a magistrate in the Parliament of Bordeaux. He was what they call a cautious jurist. He didn't make any waves. He didn't try to do anything outlandish. But he wrote a series of letters called the Parisian letters, which were supposed to be the letters between two Parisian visitors to France. And he likened France absolutism to the Parisian despotism. Very thinly veiled criticism of France and her way of life. The Spirit of Laws, written in 1748, was a work in comparative historical sociology. He followed Newton in some of his approach. So how do structures and institutions shape the laws of a country? There's different forms of government, and what kind of spirit characterizes each one of them. Now, if you're in a republic, it's because of virtue of the citizens. If you're in a monarchy, it's because you're going to have honor. You're going to respect the king and yourself. Despotism was ruled by fear. So you can have an enlightened monarch, or you can have a despotic monarch. And he spelled out the dangers, the drift toward despotism in France, how we're getting more and more into that area of fear is going to rule things. He really admired the British system of separation and balanced powers between the parliament and the monarchy. He said checks and balances are needed in good government, which is very true. Diderot and the Encyclopedia. The encyclopedia was an idea that he came up with, and he led most of the gathering of material. There's going to be a vast gathering of human knowledge and be a great statement on the philosophy's goals. Scientific analysis applied to human reason and happiness and progress. It was guided by him and Jean d'Alembert, Jean. With 17 large volumes of text, 11 volumes of illustrations. And the whole purpose was to help the general public change their way of thinking. It was going to demonstrate how the application of science could even promote progress. Oh, that was a heavy circulation. Even though it was very highly priced, it was bought by a lot of people. The government actually revoked permission to publish it for trying to, quote, propagate materialism. In other words, if we can't control what you're saying, we're going to not let you say it. Caesar Baccarat wrote of crimes and punishment. It's one of the major thoughts of the philosophers. Arbitrary power, reason, and human dignity. These are not going to lead to happiness. He attacked the view that punishment represented society's vengeance on a criminal. The legitimate rationale for punishment was to maintain social order and prevent other crimes. And the original prisons were made to rehabilitate, not to hold and punish. And of course, he opposed torture and the death penalty. You're supposed to end religious warfare and the persecution of heretics and religious minorities. In other words, if you're not of the right religion, you don't need to be executed because you're a heretic. The philosophers were not atheists. According to this, they were materialists, but actually they were what we call deists. And God, as a divine clockmaker, he set the universe in motion, and he's kind of set back. He's still there, and God did create the universe, but he's not taking time to listen to you in every little prayer that you utter, and he's not involved in your everyday affairs. Most of the philosophers view Judaism and Islam as the backward religions. Gotthard Lessing, he was a little bit different. He was, as I say, contrasted to the norm. He treated the Jews sympathetically, and he wrote a book called Nathan the Wise. Well, it wasn't a book, it was a play. It was nothing but propaganda for the Jews. And the three great monotheistic religions were all three versions of the same truth. When you get right down to it, yes. A man called Moses Mendelssohn took up the question of the Jewish identity. He wrote on the religious authority of Judaism. In it, he defended the Jewish communities against anti-Semitic policies. This is Lessing and Mendelssohn conversing. As you can see, they're both Jewish. The rising states and empires growing more and more made economic issues very important. And the French physiocrats believed that mercantilist policies were misguided. They said real wealth came from the land and agricultural production, and they advocated a very simple tax system. The mercantilistic system, in case you don't understand what it is, it's basically a way for the country to keep their money in their country, such as England and France, when they had colonies, they were mercantilistic colonies. They couldn't trade with anybody but their own home country. And if France could have her colony grow something that she needed, whether it was wine or, you don't grow wine, you grow grapes, a material or something to make lace with, and not have to buy it from another country, they keep their gold in their country. So that's mercantilism. It's strictly for the benefit of the home country, the mother country, England or France or Spain or Germany or whichever one it is, to keep the gold inside their country. Now, laissez-faire is a French word. In other classes, I always say what it basically means is government hands off. Wealth and goods to circulate throughout their country without any government interference. Government hands off, no taxes, no regulations. Now, a young man by the name of Adam Smith, Scottish philosopher and economist, wrote a book called The Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. And we usually just call it the Wealth of Nations. Now, he disagreed with the centrality of agriculture. He said the central issue was the productivity of human labor, and the mercantilistic restrictions did not create real economic health. He said it would be the invisible hand of the marketplace. He said rational individuals should pursue their interests rationally and following the obvious and simple system of natural liberty. In other words, he believed that everyone should be able to make a profit, but that the government shouldn't have any restrictions on you. If you want to make a loaf of bread and sell it for $5, and the public is agreeable that this is a fair price, and that's what it should be, even if it only costs you $2 to make it. It should be a fair profit for you for making the item and, reasonably accessible to the general public. It's kind of like, when we get warnings there's going to be a hurricane, how the gas prices go up. It's called gouging. It's not because they lack gas, it's because they're going to get every dime they can out of you before the storm's over with. Something like that would not be allowed. That would be against the invisible hand of the marketplace. The economics of empire and the profitability of the colonies. Because at this time, both England and France and Germany all have colonies. Well, Germany doesn't have any colonies, but she's got a lot of people from Germany in the colonies. The new world of natural humanity and simplicity. The slave trade and humanitarianism, individual rights, and natural laws. Now, these are all going to come into being because of the colonies. Abigail Thomas Francis Rennell wrote Philosophical History of Europeans in the Two Indies. It's a total history of colonization, natural history, exploration, and commerce. Industry and trade brought improvement and progress, yes, but it also takes away a lot of freedoms. He condemned the Spanish in Mexico and Peru, and the Portuguese in Brazil, and the English in North America. He said a good government requires checks and balances. The problem? The Europeans in the New World had unlimited power. And of course, we're using this mercantilistic system where you can't trade with anyone but the home country. Now, the Atlantic slave trade hit its peak in the 18th century. For Rennell and Diderot, slavery defied natural law and natural freedom. Both of these thinkers or philosophers hesitated to criticize the slave trade. Now, this always seems strange to me. It was a condemnation of slavery in a metaphysical sense. In other words, slavery is not right. It's kind of a violation of self-government. But, it's gone on for decades. So few philosophers advocated the total abolition of slavery. Deploring slavery was not advocating abolition. So I could hate it, but I'm not saying you should set your slaves free. They often defended slavery as connected to property rights, and this is part of the problem in the American colonies with slavery, that is the slave was considered property rights, and property rights were sanctimount, and you didn't mess with a man's properties. And also the belief in environmental determinism. In other words, maybe they're not really ready for freedom. Humanitarian anti-slavery movements began to develop in the 1760s and even came to this country. But it's going to be another 100 years or more before we do anything about it. But meanwhile, we've got people out exploring this great Pacific Ocean. The irony is, we have this big continent between us, Europe and the Pacific Ocean, but we're going to explore the Pacific Ocean. Mapping the Pacific and scientific missions. Now, Louis-Antoine de Bougainville was sent by the French government to the South Pacific in 1767. He was looking for a new trade route to China and new spices, the same thing he'd been looking for when we started the Age of Exploration. He found and described Tahiti, beautiful place, women beautiful, the whole bit. Captain John Cook made 2 trips to the South Pacific. He charted the coast of New Zealand, New Holland, New Hebrides, and Hawaii. He explored the Antarctic continent and the Bering Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. The travel accounts of these voyages were read by a large number of people in Europe and the Americas, just for information, for excitement of the adventure of traveling to these places, of seeing the people described. It was phenomenal. But the 18th century was fascinated by the stories of these new cultures. Diderot wrote a supplement about the voyages of the Bougainville, and the Tahitians were the original human beings. Humanity in its natural state, uninhibited sexuality and freedom from religious dogma, simplicity versus the over-civilized Europeans. Oh, what a life to lead. Alexander von Humboldt spent 5 years in Spanish America and wrote about it in his travels. And it's actually going to lead up and give Darwin some ideas and about the evolutionary changes. But new knowledge began slow change from Eurocentric view of the world. You know, we've always thought things started in Europe. Africa thinks they started in Africa. Russia thinks they started it there. I mean, everybody has their own centric view. But now we've got new cultures, and people no longer merely primitive versions of Europeans. All people are part of a shared humanity. That's a strange concept. How revolutionary was the Enlightenment? Well, the world of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He quarreled with and contradicted other philosophers. He attacked privilege and believed in the goodness of humanity. He introduced a notion of sensibility, in other words, the cult of feelings. Used to be, and when I was raised as a child, this was I was raised. If I was a lady, I would never show feelings in public. I would never act on my feelings or emotions. I would act on reasonable thought. It didn't work with me. It didn't work with a lot of people, as a matter of fact. He was the first to speak of popular sovereignty and democracy, and the most utopian of the philosophers. Man was born free, and everywhere he is in change. Rousseau wrote that. He wrote about the origins of government and the legitimacy of government. He wrote about social inequality and private property. Legitimate authority arises from the people alone, and society and sovereignty should not be divided among different branches of the government. Exercising sovereignty would transform the nation. The national community could be unified by the general will. In other words, our leaders should be the people we choose to lead us. Citizens were bound by mutual obligation rather than coercive laws, and the citizens' common interests represented in the whole. Rousseau wrote a story called Emily, story of a young boy educated in a school of nature. The children should not be forced to reason early in life. They should be allowed to be children. And I'm going to get on my soapbox for just a minute. In this day's society, our children are not allowed to be children. They're given... I have a grandson who's 6 months old, and he was given a toy, a desktop computer to play with. And yes, it made sounds, and the pictures on the screen were of animals and things, but I thought, what is a child? When's he going to use his imagination? He's having these pictures put before him. He doesn't have to think. It's there before him. He's not imagining anything. He's not playing. He's not... Well, anyway, I don't think you should have a computer until you know how to spell. The aim was moral autonomy and good citizenship. Unfortunately, here I disagree with him. Women were useful as mothers and wives only. And that feeling held through a lot part of the 20th century. Natural is better, simpler, and uncorrupted. He had some good ideas, but some of them went too far. This one novelette wrote 70 editions, or printed 70 editions in less than 30 years. It was all about domestic and material values. It said humans ruled by their hearts as much as their heads. This is very true. Middle class and aristocratic sensibility. Spontaneous feelings. Don't always go with your head. Go with your heart sometimes. And the Enlightenment and gender. Well, education was a key to social progress, but should education be for all? Were men and women different? Were gender differences created by the society, or were they natural? And I'll ask you a question. You think a baby cares whether he wears blue booties or pink booties? Isn't it us? We give dolls to the girls and cars to the boys. Are we not, as the parents and aunts and uncles, aren't we not socially creating this sexual difference? Émile du Châtelet, and he called for the education of women. Emily du Châtelet, she was completed the translation and the commentary of Newton's Principia Mathematica. Oh my word, she must have been one brilliant young lady. But Rochelle's sharpest critic was a lady called Mary Wollstonecraft, and she wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792. Very Republican. Spoke out against the inequality and artificial distinctions of rank, birth, or wealth. That society should seek to the perfection of our nature and capability of happiness. And women had the same innate capacity for reason and self-government as men. Virtue was the same thing for men and women, and relationships between the sexes ought to be based on equality. Very forward-thinking lady. On the family, the legal inequalities of marriage law, oh, word. Once you got married, everything you had and brought to the marriage becomes your husband's. Women were taught to be dependent and seductive in order to win husbands. That education has to promote liberty and self-reliance and the common humanity of men and women. There should be a natural division of labor between men and women, and hinting that women should have some political rights. Whoa. Now, because of the expansion of printing and print culture, we begin to see a book trade grow, and an international and clandestine book trade was even developing because in some countries things were banned, and growth of daily newspapers, not weekly or monthly, daily. The British press was relatively free of restriction, but censorship only made books more expensive and more desired. The philosophical books were kind of like subversive literature of all kinds, and they had to kind of go into the 18th century literary underground. And networks of readers and new forms of sociability and discussion, because the elite or high culture was small and very cosmopolitan. They joined together members of the nobility and the wealthy members of the middle class into learned societies. In America, we had the Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, which was founded incidentally by Ben Franklin. You had the Select Society of Edinburgh. You had the organized intellectual life outside of universities. And you had provided libraries and meeting places for discussions and published journals. But the elites also met in academies. They met in the Royal Society of London, the French Academy of Literature, Berlin Royal Academy. And they all together, when you would get there, you would have a sense of common purpose and seriousness. It wasn't something fun and games. It was serious. And sometimes things would be organized by well-connected and learned aristocratic women called salons, where they would bring together men and women of letters, in other words, they could read and write, as members of the aristocracy. And they were located in all the major cities in Europe and the Americas. There were other societies. There were Masonic lodges. There were secret societies with elaborate rituals, egalitarian societies. They all pledged themselves to rational thought in all human affairs. There was coffee houses that aided the circulation of new ideas. The coffee houses in the 1700s and 1800s were far different from the coffee houses we have today. The public sphere and public opinion. They wanted the ability to think and criticize freely. The effect on politics? Yeah, you begin moving politics beyond just the legal courts. This is just an example of a lady who was very popular at the time. She kind of set the stage for these meetings in her home. The middle class culture and reading, yes. Literature is spreading. Shopkeepers, small merchants, lawyers, and professionals. You have a different reading public. They bought and they borrowed books. And a lot of these books that were written were targeted to middle-class women. They were popularized in the Enlightenment treatise on education and the mind. And, of course, the novel is coming along. We're not just going to be studying the histories or a philosophical thought. Now we're going to have stories. Samuel Richardson wrote about Pamela and Clarissa. Daniel Defoe wrote Moll Flanders and Robinson Crusoe, a very adventurous story. Henry Fielding wrote Tom Jones, and there was a sexually component to that one, believe me. And Jane Austen wrote Pride and Prejudice and Emma. And I think, don't we have Pride and Prejudice that's being broadcast on TV now? Literacy was viewed by gender, class, and location. And the greatest literacy in Europe was in Northern Europe. It was very high in towns and cities. Broadsides, woodcuts, prints, drawings, cartoons, they were all available now in this new reading material. Formal education was really rather haphazard. I mean, it wasn't required and the state didn't pay for it. But networks of sociability, you had the guild organizations offering discussion and companionship groups. They offered street theater and singers, and market days and village festivals were a high time. Oral and literate cultures began to overlap. You had the poor people who didn't know how to read and write, who depended on oral tradition to learn their history, overlapping with somebody who might live next door to you, knew how to read and knew the difference. And sometimes you get these two mixed up. The philosophies and popular culture. The Enlightenment was primarily an urban phenomenon, and not so much out in the farm, basically in the cities. And it looked at popular culture of common people with distrust and ignorance. But you've got war and politics also going on during this time, and you've got a continuation of the colonial imperial wars, the 9 Years' War, the War of Spanish Succession in particular. In 1740, part of the problem was to keep one country from becoming too powerful, you had to had a balance of equality out. I mean, you didn't want one country getting ahead of the other. Prussia's attempt to wrest more power from the Habsburgs, and then France joins Prussia, and Great Britain supports Austria. And there's a war, and it wins largely in a stalemate. And believe it or not, things pretty much went back the way they were. But Prussia was not able to get what she wanted. 7 Years' War, known in this country as the French and Indian War, where European powers again fought around the globe. It wasn't just here in this country. Canada, India, Africa, Caribbean, North America, Europe. We thought it was just here, right? No, the French and Indian War was fought everywhere. Austria and France joined forces in fear of the Prussian threat, because she's really growing, and they're great militaristics. Great Britain's allies with Prussia. And all of a sudden, William Pitt becomes a very powerful prime minister in England, and the rise of William Pitt leads to significant victory for Great Britain. Treaty of Paris, they met in Versailles. France was removed from the New World in India. Spain loses Florida, but gains Louisiana, Cuba, and the Philippines. Prussia holds Sicily and gains more territory from the Habsburg. France was not fully defeated, but England was in debt. Enlightened absolutism. Monarchs centralized their administrations, increased taxes, and created professional armies, and tightened their control on the churches in their various countries. Now, Empress Maria Theresa of Austria created a statewide system of primary education. Good. She relaxed censorship, and she instituted a more liberal criminal code, so she was once known as an enlightened despot. Frederick II of Prussia, or we knew him as Frederick the Great, consolidated Prussian control over all Polish territories between East Prussia and Brandenburg, and fashioned the most professional and efficient bureaucracy in Europe. That really wasn't depending on the Enlightenment. This was depending on force. Catherine the Great of Russia, she corresponded with French philosophers, and she founded hospitals and orphanages. She expanded the Russian Empire after the wars with the Ottoman Empire. And she was doing pretty good things until all of a sudden the peasants revolted and she got perturbed, so she stopped all of her enlightened changes. The revolution served in America as an opportunity for a lot of enlightenment ideas, and Great Britain had imposed a series of new taxes on its American colonies to pay off the 7 Years' War. And it's going to be a very, very brief overview of the American Revolution, folks, so don't get panicky. The colonists complained about their lack of representation in Parliament, no taxation without representation. And a series of events from 763 to 773 increased tension between the colonists and the mother country, culminating in the Boston Tea Parties. Parliament chose to impose a series of acts that the Americans called coercive acts, which galvanized the support of all throughout the colonies. Representatives from the colonies met to form something called the Continental Congress. The first clashes of war occurred in 1775 around Boston, and the Colonial Army was formed. July the 4th, 1776, 13 colonies formally declared their independence from Great Britain. 2 years later, France joined the war on the side of the Americans. And in 1781, the French and American forces defeat the British at Yorktown, Virginia. And the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, ending the war, declaring independence of the colonies into a new nation. Bet you never went through the American Revolution that fast before. Conclusion. Science is a form of knowledge. General enthusiasm for discovery and understanding across a wide range of topics. Rising problems to public awareness. New forms of ideas for civic government were raised, leading some of them to become, I guess you'd say, uncomfortable. Some people became uncomfortable with the new concepts that moved away from tradition. And one of them had to do with imperialism and slavery. Uh, so, what is a philosopher? A free thinker. I think on your word list you have, it's just one page. You got the Holy Trinity, Voltaire, Montesquieu, Diderot, and the Encyclopedia, Moses Mendelssohn, Cesar Becerra, Louis Antoine de Bougainville, Captain James Cook, Mary Wollstonecraft, the enlightened absolutist, Catherine the Great, Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 happenings or events ending with the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution, which I've never. I'm sorry. Let's see what this little thing has to say, and then we will call it quits on chapter 17.
Hey guys, moving on to our third concept. As you can see, we're going to start talking about what is the impact of the Enlightenment. We just got done talking about what the Enlightenment is, what the who the people are that, and the scientific ideas that were going on during the Enlightenment. Now we're going to look at the impact this Enlightenment idea has on society and culture. And as you can see, that is the essential question for this video. This is going to be a real quick video. It's not going to be too long, so let's get through. First up, some social effects of the Enlightenment. Number one, women's rights. As you saw in the previous video with the philosophers, there were several women philosophers that were making noise during the Enlightenment and broadcasting these ideas that women should be treated equally to men. Real quick, women who argued for equality were ridiculed and condemned. And philosophies believed natural rights of women extended only to the home and family. So women had rights in their own house and amongst their own family, but when it came to society and anything outside of the family life, they would have to be seen as subordinate. They would not get that equal treatment that they would in their own house. As you'll see, there's a growth of reading, mainly coming from the printing press. Literacy rates increased throughout the 1700s. This creates demand for reading materials, increases the number of books published, and development of magazines and newspapers that we know of today will get their start at this point. And here is a literacy rate amongst males between a 200-year period, 1600 and 1800. As you can see, in France, 1/6 of the population actually knew how to read in 1600. Fast forward 200 years later, that number increases to 2/3, or about 66%. Same kind of jump, a little bit less of a jump for literacy rates for males in England and the 200-year span. It jumps from 1/4 to 1/2, so about 25%, which is still is not insignificant. Salons. These are the areas where the philosophies will be doing most of their talking. Because remember, that is the one thing that they like to do, is they like to hear themselves talk. This is an organized opportunity for philosophers, writers, and artists to interact with one another. This helps to facilitate the spread of Enlightenment ideas. It is because of this talking that people start getting exposed to these new ideas, and then they start talking to other people, and these ideas to spread outward. Wealthy women host gatherings in their urban homes. Came from tradition of entertaining social elite of cities. So if there was a upper class social layer, you wanted to get them in your house to kind of start entertaining and having a good time, and then they would also help spread these ideas amongst those parties. Madame Giroflin served as model and mentor for salons. So she was kind of the one that started this salon idea, and then people took that idea and ran with it amongst other salons in France. Tone was usually serious, but not leisurely. This was not a time to relax. This was usually a very serious discussion, vigorous debates, and served an important role in education of women. So while the women were working in the salons, they were actually listening to the men talk, taking these ideas, getting them for themselves, and then starting to learn from them, start to become more educated just by listening to these people talk. And then some legacy of the Enlightenment. Enlightenment challenged old ideas about society. Divine right of monarchs is going to be challenged. The union of church and state. As you can see from the last video with the philosophers, many of them argued against the union of church and state. Existence of unequal social classes. Once again, many of them did not agree with the idea. They wanted more equality amongst everybody. Three effects of the Enlightenment were: 1. Belief in progress. Human reason can solve problems in society and the natural world. A more secular or non-religious outlook, so finally starting to separate religion from all the other aspects of their life and creating that barrier. And then rise of individualism, that rise of the idea of the individual and that people should be known for their work and take credit for their work and seek the admiration of people whenever they do a good job. Okay guys, like I said, this was a short video. Just wanted to touch on the legacy of the Enlightenment and the impact that it will have. As you can see, a lot of these ideas are, hopefully are able to see at least, a lot of these ideas are what are going to form the basis of the United States and the modern world that we know of today will get a start back at this point. Until next time, I'll see you guys.
That really concludes the lecture on 17. Is that when I took this course, I mean, we had to spend 3 days on our philosophers, but since we've only got a short time, everything is very abbreviated. Now, if school is closed because of the impending storm, I will record chapter 18, which is the French Revolution. Otherwise, when we get back to class on Wednesday, we'll start chapter 18, the Revolution. Be safe.